This video contains 10 ideas, each of which I got from a course Au5 did for Donation, today's sponsor. In the course, he walks you through how he made the wildly successful track Alien Weapon. For each idea, I'll add some details that weren't included in the course, extending them with some tricks of my own. And importantly, these are the concepts that I found most interesting as someone with 12 years of experience. Everyone will take away something different. Newer producers, for example, will find it most useful to see how a complex track fits together in a DAW project. The course is tightly edited with lots of additional bits and bobs included too. 55% off using the link in the description below. Oh, and before we get started, in case you're wondering, the blue light you see behind me is courtesy of these things called Pavo tubes, which the excellent people at Nanlight sent over to me. I absolutely love them, but I'll tell you more about my lighting setup in a future video. Let's dive in. Be scientific and take the guesswork out of EQing. Using tonal balance control, Au5 checked the drops against a 4.5 dB per octave white noise curve, which he imported himself.
This is a very fine, specific line, and if I know that the drops are within this line, then all of the frequencies are spectrally balanced and sound perceptively flat.
As you can see here in ProQ3's help text, 4.5 dB per octave is a good approximation for how loudness is perceived by the human ear. I made my own 4.5 dB per octave by taking white noise and applying a flat tilt EQ curve in ProQ3. This puts it right in between pink noise and brown noise. I'll include a download link for this noise in the description below. Naturally. If possible, check a part of the track that includes the full frequency range. But of course, if you're making some minimal techno thing that doesn't fill each frequency band, then you won't be able to match this guide perfectly. And this 4.5 dB per octave guideline is only relevant to the mid frequencies upwards, approximately 500 Hz and up. It's not that this is objectively correct and perfect, it's that this is a safe target to minimize the chance of any extreme peaks or extreme troughs at playback. As you can see, speakers reproduce frequencies in a wide range of ways, so it's safest to create an audio file with a flat frequency response. I love the purity of this approach. I've historically measured frequency balance using isotope Au5, using Knife Party's track Bonfire as a reference, but I should probably distance myself from, 10 years old? Old software, very old software, especially now I'm on Apple Silicon as my main machine anyway. And I should also say, you don't necessarily need tonal balance control to do this. In ProQ2, you can set the spectrum analyzer to 4.5 dB per octave. In fact, I think it defaults to that. And hover your mouse near the spectrum line to take a measurement. Doing this, you're aiming for flat. Get creative though, you could pretty much do this with any spectrum analyzer and screenshots. But of course it's easier with the right tools. As an Easter egg, Au5 carved his logo into the song using Soothe 2. You can see it when viewing the track through a spectrogram.
There it is.
Spectrograms are just like spectrum analyzers. Vertically, we have frequency, brightness is the intensity of that frequency, and this is plotted horizontally in time. I find them most useful in tools like Isotope RX for doing audio repair. But artists have been hiding images in their spectrograms for years now. Maybe the most famous example of this would be the Demon Face found in Aphex Twin's formula. Yep, and this is technically the correct, look it up, that is technically the correct track name from Window Liquor, I think it was. Yeah. Many tools exist to make spectrogram images, and I use a free one, an online one. If the website goes down, just Google something like image to audio. There are many available. And I should point out, to see the image undistorted, you might need to change the spectrogram to display linearly, not logarithmically. And sometimes the image itself is usable directly in the song. But if not, you can do what Au5 did and carve those frequencies out of something already in the song.
I used Soothe 2. I used its sidechain input on the master to carve out my logo into the high frequencies of this entire part of the song.
Beautiful. To give the drops more impact, on the master channel before the limiter, he automated EQ, and stereo width.
I am using this rack that I call the master tweaker, and all it is just one knob that shelves down the lows and the highs and narrows the stereo image. And I kind of ride this automation where I feel like there is tension building. I usually put this before drops or between transitional parts of the drops, just to make them sound much more punctual once the macro goes back to 0.
The drop sounds better because the bit before the drop was softer and narrower than usual. In a similar spirit, look at what Kai Wadji, am I saying his name right? Kai Wadji did in his dubstep track Sin. See how he automated limiter output level, sometimes known as ceiling, during build-ups? By reducing peak level before the drop has more impact. In other genres, you might automate limiter input gain instead and choose to keep full dynamic range at all times, but the overflattened sound is fundamental to dubstep these days, so a reduction in dynamic range isn't a problem here.
So this is just a saw wave without its fundamental. As you can see, there's no fundamental. The reason that I do that is so I can detune it, but also have a solid sub that is not detuned.
When creating super saws in Serum, if you're playing low notes, avoid sub-bass phasing by using remove fundamental. Otherwise, see how the sub-bass here is wobbling around? Easiest to hear through a low-pass filter. This isn't ideal. We want a clean, powerful, monophonic sub-bass, like this. So in the wavetable editor, choose Remove Fundamental. Now we can add in a clean sine wave to replace it using something like the sub-oscillator. Fantastic. To help give a bass modulation more definition, try adding a click transient to the start of each modulation.
I also layered some white noise. And these are just really short, really loud transients to just accentuate the movement in the bass stem. Combined. Just make it a little bit more percussive. And I also do that at the very end with this bass. Combine with this, and we get this.
In Alien Weapon, he created the clicks using white noise in a sampler with an extremely short amplitude envelope, but it might be easier to simply layer audio clips. You don't consciously hear the clicks in a busy mix, but you do subconsciously. They draw your ear's attention to the start of each bass modulation. Here's a before and after on one of my own sounds. Whilst it's easy enough to cut transients out of almost any audio file, it can be useful to have a folder full of them. This way you can quickly cycle through them in context with everything playing. If you have Serum, you could use Serum's folder of attacks for this, and I have my own sample pack available on multiplier.audio called Transients and Useful Clicks. Lovely stuff. Here's something Au5 called a dephased saw.
So I have this other Serum layer going on in this part of the song. It's quite an ugly sound, in my opinion, just soloed. Yeah, it just looks like a dephased saw wave.
It's as harmonically thick as a saw, but softer. Take a standard sawtooth, right-click the phase bins and select Randomize All. Excellent. I noticed that Au5 often uses Ableton's corpus effect to add a resonant texture to things.
It's actually Harmor and Corpus, and I'm just using the corpus. Yeah, then I enable the corpus. Otherwise, it just sounds like that.
If you don't use Ableton, you can do something similar with a plugin called Object Delay by Applied Acoustic Systems. Corpus is a resonator, resonating at a pitch you set here. Easiest to see on Pink Noise at 100% wet. Each model providing a different set of resonant peaks. increase quality to get as many peaks as possible. Inharmonicity spreads these peaks apart so they're no longer multiples of the pitch frequency and therefore sound unnatural, inharmonic and somewhat metallic. And by pulling back on decay time, it stops ringing out and becomes more of a texture than a resonant tone. We're using pink noise here to visualize what it's doing, but let's see this corpus on an actual sound. Au5 showed an interesting way to make something called quanta noise, as in quantized noise.
On the oscilloscope, we can see that it's random noise, but it's quantized. Now, if we use an EQ and filter out all of the low end using a high pass filter, and then play it, now you get this crackly type of noise where there's a lot of silence in between. I actually got this technique from WorldWave. She suggested that I layer quanta noise over my snares, and that will give them more of a grit and less of a, I guess, like smoothness. And it's subtle. You can kind of hear it in the middle of the snare, but I think it was all that it needed to really just make a banging snare.
It's like crackle when you can visualize it as less dense noise. And he made it using a non-standard technique, in this case using some white noise and Ableton's vocoder. The trick here is knowing to go down on the XY pad. But what's the vocoder actually doing? It's taking amplitude and frequency information from the input audio and putting that onto the carrier source selected here. So inputting a future mumble I made, ding, 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 vocoding it onto this fixed pitch pulse wave. And it sounds much more exciting if we let the pulse wave track the input audio's pitch. But if we instead vocode the input audio onto some noise, see how it's taking amplitude and frequency information of the mumble, ding, 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 and putting it on white noise. If we then make the white noise less dense and input something with random amplitude and frequency information, i.e. white noise, you have some delightfully random crackle. As a fun alternative way to make crackle, try output crackle only or output clicks only using audio repair software Isotope RX. I made some of my favourite sounds in Magic Crackles using this technique.
Especially right after a section that's very legato and like a wall of sound. I wanted something that was like more staccato-y, straighter, just for contrast.
Songwriting tip, it's good to have a staccato bass section after a legato one. Let me define these words using MIDI notes. Legato, staccato, legato, staccato, legato, staccato, legato, staccato. You get the idea. Anyway, listen for this in Alien Weapon. You don't need to remember these technical words, but it's probably worth remembering legato. Legato is a word you see all over the music production world, and whilst it means something different in each context, it usually refers to behaviour when notes are connected like this, not unconnected like this. In Italian, legato means tied together. A few years ago, White and I ran a series on the channel called In the Door, where we interviewed some of the biggest names in bass music about how they made a popular song. And it turns out, instead of spending every session working on a song, sometimes all they do is generate audio files. This gives them a library of unique sounds that they can then sequence or resample when they're in the songwriting mindset.
And then Bass Design Jam called Harmer Funkery, which I've been using for a while, just, finding new little bits in here. This main one is actually just a really long bass jam that I made. All I did was just take that bass jam that I did and I right-clicked it and then hit slice to new MIDI track. And then there's a mode in there that lets you slice by transients. And it just created this drum rack just full of different sounds that I can just choose from. This thing is also a resampled sound. Let's see what else it sounds like. Reused and repurposed from other sessions that I was just experimenting with. They're basically just like a bunch of different bass design jams that I just gathered over the years. And then when you add a processing chain to them, you can glue them all together.
Yes, some of the sounds were made in the main project, but many of them were made previously in dedicated sound design sessions. It's like you're making a sample pack for future you. It's a beautiful idea. Once again, to get 55% off, use the link in the description below. Me and you, the light behind me's blue. This is why I'm not generally involved in the songwriting process.